thank you all for joining us on what I think will be a really interesting and challenging conversation on one of the sustainability crises of our time. So this is the session on how do we find ways to decarbonize our economies and transition industry into a sustainable future. So a really key issue in the green energy transition is equity. So the countries who can most afford to transition to green energy are those who have contributed the most to the pollution of the Earth throughout history and most to the 1.7 trillion tons of CO2 released into the Earth's atmosphere over the lifetime of this planet. So together we need to find equitable ways to help resource-poor countries accelerate the green transition to green energy without compromising their much-needed economic growth. How we do this is a challenge, but there's no one better suited to address these tough questions head-on than Geeta Wirjawan. So thank you so much for being here today. Really looking forward to hearing what you say. So I guess that first question is that big one. So how can we achieve the three, it says here sometimes competing goals, maybe they're not competing, goals of energy decarbonisation, economic growth and social flourishing?
That question is apt for many of us in Southeast Asia. And we are in Bangkok, which is the capital city of Thailand, a member of the Southeast Asian Countries or Association. I think it's safe to say that Southeast Asia represents the instinct of any developing country around the world, be it India or Nigeria or some of the, if not many of the sub-Saharan countries. And I want to put this in the context of the instinct of the average citizen of Southeast Asia to develop. And development means typically the desire to become more modern, right? And modernization can be manifested in so many things or metrics. We can take a look at the quality of healthcare, the quality of welfare, the quality of intellect, the quality of moral value, the quality of social value. But one metric that I think simplifies the degree to which any particular person or nation becomes modern is whether or not he or she can use his or her mobile phone, can cook, and whatever. That's manifested in electrification, right? And the electrification for Southeast Asia is a lot less than 6,000 kilowatt hour per capita, with the absolute exception of Singapore and Brunei, which are electrified at around 10,000 kilowatt hour per capita. Modernity, I think, should be defined at about 6,000 kilowatt hour per capita. Two large developing countries, call them India and Indonesia. India being outside Southeast Asia, Indonesia being the largest population in Southeast Asia, 43% of the population of Southeast Asia, 43% of the collective GDP of Southeast Asia. They're both electrified at around 1,300 kilowatt hour per capita, with India having built around 400,000 megawatts, Indonesia having built around 80,000 megawatts, with respective capacities to build on a yearly basis of 19,000 megawatts for India and 3,000 megawatts for Indonesia. At that rate, it would take India and Indonesia more than 100 years to reach electrification on a per capita per year basis at 6,000. A 100-year period is completely irreconcilable with the aspiration to attain carbon neutrality in 2050, which is only about 26 years away. This, I think, underlines the not only irreconcilable nature, but it underlines the paradoxical nature of the narrative of sustainability, which I've argued in many instances as one that is just a little too elitist. It resonates to people that have the wherewithal to put food on the table, but it doesn't resonate to many of us, if not most of us on the planet, who are still struggling to put food on the table, which is about 85% of the population of the planet, irrespective of whether your energy is carbon emitting or not. That's because the instinct is to try to put food on the table as economically feasible as possible. Now, the challenge forward is how do we get Southeast Asia up to 6,000 kilowatt hour per capita, with the exception of Brunei and Singapore, for all 8 remaining countries of Southeast Asia to reach electrification of 6,000 kilowatt hour per capita, we're going to have to build close to 400,000 megawatts worth of power generation capabilities. Sorry, 1 terawatt, close to 1 million or around 1 million megawatts worth of power generation capabilities. At a cost of $2 million per megawatt, we're talking about needing $2 trillion. So it's a choice for us in Southeast Asia. If we want to be modern, we're going to have to figure out how to get $2 trillion. If not, we so choose not to be modern. And if we want to be modern in an environmentally friendly manner, we have to procure $2 trillion. The technology is available in Europe, in the UK, in the US, in China, but all these technologies for renewable capabilities can only be availed at a cost of 15 cents per kilowatt hour. Whereas the purchasing power of most developing economies is no more than 5 cents. So how do you figure out, right? I mean, those two are only going to be able to intersect at such time when the 5 cents goes up to 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and at such time when the 15 cents comes down to 14, 13, 12. So the challenge is a lot less technological, but it's a lot more economic. The problem with Southeast Asia is that we don't have a lot of money. So we have to get the money from outside. And outside, there is a lot of money. And that's sitting in the G7 countries. But that money is not being allocated to many parts of the world. It's just circulating amongst themselves. Let me pause right there.
So, I mean, I think you're describing a situation that I think we would all recognize, even though we may not be able to put the numbers on it. I mean, as I mentioned, the country that I live in, the UK, the US, has pumped more of the CO2 into the atmosphere than the country that you live in. And it is not fair of us to say, hey guys, you mustn't do it. We've done it, but you mustn't. But we share the same planet. So do you have any sort of sense of optimism that the G7 countries might come to the aid of other countries? Because if this is all of our problem, we can afford to pay more to solve that than the country that you live in can. How can we work together to make sure it all works in a way that doesn't keep people in poverty in Indonesia, India, and China? Because China's doing okay. Indonesia and India, because that's simply just not fair.
I do. And the reason why I've been trumpeting this narrative is that there is a lot of money. The G7 countries altogether, they are in control of about $100 trillion worth of liquidity. About $60 trillion of those are basically managed by what I call the transnational investment firms. The biggest one of which is BlackRock, which manages about $11 trillion. The second one is Vanguard, which manages around $10 trillion. And all the other 15 will manage the remaining parts of the $60 trillion, right? But these guys are not being approached by people with the right kind of risk-return profile stories. And this is, I think, what leads us or what takes us to what the Southeast Asians have to do. The Southeast Asians have not come to the recognition that there is a lot of money out there. They've not come to the recognition that they've got to build upon the pre-existing building blocks. That's really to make sure that we have the ability to assure competence, accountability, and integrity. Because money, they travel from one place to another, not because of ideology, not because of geography. but it travels because of trustworthiness, irrespective of ideology. This is where Singapore has been taking a lot of the lunch away from the other Southeast Asian countries. Because on a yearly basis, the foreign direct investment that comes to Southeast Asia is about $200 billion from all over the world. Half of that goes to Singapore, which is about $100 billion. The other $100 billion is split up amongst all the other 9 countries. Indonesia is a beneficiary of about $26 to $30 billion a year. The Philippines, Thailand, Malaysia, Vietnam, and all the others are averaging around $15 to $20 billion. Much less the Laotians, the Myanmaris, the Cambodians. They're getting a lot less than whatever the other big countries are. That's because they do not speak English as well as they should. That's because they cannot show to the world that they can actually be competent, full of integrity, and accountable for whatever they're supposed to be doing. And they're not great storytellers yet. To the extent that we Southeast Asians become good, if not great storytellers, to the extent that we can account for our narratives, to the extent that we can be of integrity, to the extent that we can show competence the way the Singaporeans have for the last few decades, I'm actually very optimistic. We're going to be able to get that $2 trillion using whatever technology. And this is the baseline, right? And the baseline is likely to be rebased upward if we are to start talking about AI. When you talk about AI, if you take a look at the investments by venture capital firms about 2 years ago, the Americans poured in about $38 billion on AI. The Asians, most of which are Chinese, poured in about $27, $28 billion. The Europeans only $8 billion. Don't ask me why the Europeans only poured only $8 billion.
We don't like spending money.
But this basically dovetails to the recognition that the future is going to be great. And if you listen to the NVIDIAs of the world, the Jensen Huangs of the world, when he's talking about building the next GPU capability is basically going to be 20x or 30x of the preceding GPU capability. So when one talks about 20xing the pre-existing capacity, inevitably one has to think about the energy requirement, which is going to be 20 times, which is going to be 30 times. So the old story would have been that if the planet were to become modern, it needs to go from a pre-existing electrification of about 7 terawatt to about 16 terawatt. Not going to happen if everybody wants to AI himself or herself the way the Chinese and the Americans are. I think we're looking at the possibility of basically electrifying the planet up to 25 terawatt. Now, if we're talking about electrifying the planet or humanity up to 25 terawatt, then we've got to rebase the baseline. Rebasing the baseline, basically for Southeast Asia from needing only $2 trillion, it'll be about $4 to $5 trillion. But I'm actually optimistic. The money's there, but the doors are just not being knocked by the right storytellers.
Okay, great. So I'm guessing most people in the room are from academic institutions or people who work closely with academic institutions. I liked your accountability, integrity, and competence. And I guess as academic institutions, those could be some of our watchwords. It's certainly values that we try and live by. So how can universities partner with governments, industry to nudge this activity in the right direction without just being passive bystanders? Because we've got a lot of expertise.
The low-hanging fruit is making sure that humanity speaks whatever language that's spoken by people with money, right? Put this in the context of Southeast Asia. In Indonesia, there's no more than 10 million people who speak English in a context of 280 million people. In Southeast Asia, there's no more than 60 to 70 million people that speak English in a context of 700 million people. The low-hanging fruit would be for any academic domain to make sure that that 10 million figure in Indonesia goes up to 100 million. To make sure that that 70 million figure in Southeast Asia goes up to 400 million. If and when Southeast Asia has 400 million people that speak good English, that can communicate with you, I can almost guarantee you the story of Southeast Asia will be heard loud and clear.
Okay.
The problem right now is that Southeast Asia is one of the more underrated narratives in the world. You go to Europe, you go to the US, people get a lot more excited talking about Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan, whose populations each and combined don't exceed that of Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia has $700 million people, $4 trillion collective GDP, a lot larger than the GDP of Japan, South Korea and Taiwan, almost the same as that of Japan. But people don't talk about Southeast Asia as much as they should. So I think that's the low-hanging fruit. The second, which is a little above what the low-hanging fruit is to really nurture and cross-fertilize amongst institutions so that they have the right understanding. What I notice is that there's not enough of a political culture within a household, within the schools, within the offices, within any social institutions, so that people actually takes ownership with the climate change issue, right? And how do you make sure that all the great public intellectuals coming out from any academic domain, they actually pipe their contents on TikTok, on Instagram, because that's what the public is listening to and looking at. And I think it's a real mockery in that most, if not many, public intellectuals are not piping their contents on social media platforms that are actually being viewed at disproportionately more by the public. And this explains the very nature of divergence or increasing divergence between policy postures and public opinions, pervasively all across, not just ubiquitously in Southeast Asia. This is not uniquely Southeast Asian problem. It is pervasive and ubiquitous all over the world, in the sense that I think the public intellectuals from all academic domains need to invest in piping their contents on social media or through social media platforms.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think as universities and as academics, we've sort of stopped just talking to ourselves and publishing good papers. And we all subscribe to that knowledge exchange. But in my university, I don't think you get credit for putting stuff out into Instagram and TikTok. And maybe we should, because that's the way that you reach more people rather than publishing a paper in the Lancet that
Absolutely.
You may be very proud of. So that might be something to think about. Geeta, if you're willing, I might open the floor up to questions, because you've provided a lot of food for thought, and I suspect quite a lot of people would be desperate to ask you a question and get the benefit of your thoughts. So if you want to ask a question, maybe you could just put your hand up and somebody will come and bring a mic to you. If you could say who you are and where you're from, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Rudianto from Universitas Muhammadiyah, Sumatera Utara. Good afternoon, Pak Geeta. Nice to see you here. I'm your subscriber and always watching Endgame.
What, one of the 18, is it?
You are so popular in Indonesia. My question is about when we talk about the policy of energy. As an Indonesian citizen, today we wondering about the policy of Indonesian government that issue the license of business of mining to the religion organization in Indonesia, you know that? And I want to ask you, what the impact of this policy to our future? And what is the difference between organization based on religion and corporate when they're running the mining business? Thank you.
I thought this was supposed to be about sustainable development.
It's so related.
Look, I think the country is poised for great growth trajectory, right? I will try to answer your question by not answering your question. And I think it's good to be optimistic about the future, right? And Indonesia, just from a baseline standpoint, is poised to grow at a rate of 5% per year, right? And if you take a look at the portion of manufacturing versus the GDP, it's actually only 16%. All the others, Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia, they're all at way above 20%, right? So you need to figure out how to move that needle from 16% to any point above 20%. The way to do that is to actually invest in STEM. And I've been arguing for STEM right? Whether you come from spiritual background, you come from an entrepreneurial background, you come from a mining background, I think it's important to usher a certain political culture where what's important for Indonesia is to actually invest in STEM, right? Because STEM dovetails into our ability to increase marginal productivity. Indonesia's marginal productivity is only at $25,000. The marginal productivity of Singapore is at $211,000, right? And in a global order that's becoming a lot more multipolar, which ironically entails a lot more bilateralism as opposed to multilateralism, any particular country is inevitably forced to basically show greater productivity because you're in a room with only one person. You can't leverage off someone else's size to basically negotiate with someone else in that room that would have been filled with 190 people previously. So I think it's important to think about the big picture. What would it take for Indonesia to rebase itself from 5% to 7 or 8%? I think it's going to require a much bigger investment in STEM or technology, right? Whether you're coming from a spiritual background or others. Now, the second point I want to make is that we take a look at Southeast Asia's GDP per capita growth in the last 30 years. It would have been about 2.7 times. Right? China's GDP per capita growth would have been about 10 times. And it's highly identifiable as to why we underperformed with respect to China. Because of underinvestment in education, underinvestment in infrastructure, lack of governance, and lack of competitiveness. So whatever we do, let's try to figure out so that we can up the ante on education, up the ante on infrastructure, up the ante on governance, and up the ante on competitiveness. We are living in a post-truth era where we're exposed to the inability to separate facts from opinions. When you don't know what the facts are, you tend to opine. And that's a tragedy, right? And that, I think, has negative repercussions on our ability to find the optimal intersection between power and talent, which unfortunately is a discount to our ability to meritocratize. So I do believe that, you know, when we talk about a certain thing or a certain sector, try to figure out what it takes for us to actually invest more in education, invest more in infrastructure, invest more in competence or governance, invest more in competitiveness.
Great. Another question right at the back there. Ideally on sustainability.
Hi, my name is Annette Bos. I'm from Monash University in Australia. And thank you. And I'm just listening to your argument, especially on the language. And I think at universities and as part of sustainable development, we're really thinking indigenous knowledge, decolonizing our research, having agendas around that. And we've got far to go. And that's not only for Australia, that's in all the areas we're talking about. And on the other hand, here, you're making the arguments that we need to think about, you know, whole regions becoming much more Anglo-focused, if we're talking about languages. You know, I don't know how to reconcile those two.
I can. I can reconcile. When I go home, I speak my home language, right? But when I go to Bangkok and speak at a conference, I got to make sure that I can communicate to you. And this is the Lee Kuan Yew model, right? He basically made sure in the 60s that if you're a Tamil, Malay, Chinese, or Eurasian, you speak your indigenous language at home. But when you go to school, when you go to the office, you make sure you speak English, right? And this is what I'm advocating. This is not a zero-sum game with respect to the indigeneity of, you know, our pre-existing order, but this is really a supplemental type of consideration so that we can actually communicate better with the international community. And this is where we suck, right? And this is, I think, a point of contention that's valid if we're really serious about attaining sustainability. To the extent we're not serious about attaining sustainability, achieving carbon neutrality by 2050, by the way, it's not 1.5 degrees. It's 3 degrees by 2050. That's the realistic picture at the rate we're going, right? I think we need to be realistic about what we can't do or what we can do. And I do believe that to the extent that there's a lot of liquidity out there, we just need to be able to knock on the doors of those people that are actually allocating the capital. The technology is available, but the economic wherewithal is not there for most developing economies.
And you would think the people who are allocating the capital, their children and their grandchildren are going to be living in this world, so they should have some incentive to...
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to bring this session to a close. I'm going to give the last question to my colleague, Kylie Colvin from our Malaysia campus, because I can do that.
Thank you, Jane. It was fascinating. Thank you so much. I live in Malaysia. I've been living there for 4.5 years, and I'm filled with optimism listening to you talk. But the Association of Southeast Asian Nations don't have a good track record to date for agreeing and getting together on things. Do you think we can be optimistic about their ability to join forces in the future on all the things you've been talking about, on storytelling, on governance, on integrity, on infrastructure investment? Because I feel like that the power of them all together is going to, help scale them to the kind of the numbers that you're talking about for China, more than them trying to do it each individually.
I've had the opportunity and honor to attend hundreds of ASEAN meetings when I was previously in the government, right? And there was a sense of maybe some degree of elitism, right? Because the people that attended the meetings could speak with one another in an international language, call that English. But when they would go home, they would have to translate whatever the results of those meetings would have been to the people in their villages, hometowns, and what. And certain things got lost in translation, right? So my advocacy is to expand the wisdom so that people in the village, people in the hometowns would actually understand the first medium with which information was shared at the various ASEAN meetings. And I would make the argument that if you are in Canberra, London, Beijing, Tokyo, or Washington, if you would want to know something about Southeast Asia, the first person you call is the Singaporean ambassador. You don't call the Indonesian ambassador. You don't call the Laotian ambassador. You don't call the Thai ambassador. You don't call the Myanmarese ambassador. Because there's this predisposition that the Singaporean speaks English. That there's this predisposition that the Singaporean is smart. He or she knows what he or she is talking about. Now, if you asked me that question 3 years ago, I would have been a lot more pessimistic. But now with the advent of AI, I think it's a lot more realistic to be able to teach to 100 million people in Indonesia, 400 million people in Southeast Asia to be able to speak English in the next 5 to 10 years. To the extent that we can get that happening in the next 5 to 10 years, the storytellers of Southeast Asia are no longer going to be just Singaporean. They're going to be Laotian, Cambodian, Thai, Malaysian, Vietnamese, Indonesian, Bruneian, and all that good stuff, right? And that's entirely possible now with the advent of AI. And I've been, basically hands-on with, a thought experiment where we could actually transform somebody who couldn't speak a word of English in the eastern parts of Indonesia within 3 months to the point where he could actually speak and get a job at a 3-star hotel as a concierge. And one would think that the primary product would have been for him to get a job and put food on the table for his wife and 3 kids and 2 mates. That's secondary. What's primary is that now he thinks he can be Bill Gates. He can be Mark Zuckerberg. He can be Jeff Bezos. He can be Elon Musk. So just think about the power of instilling imagination. Just by way of introducing somebody with a language that's going to be so relevant. And I think that's going to be very, very powerful for Southeast Asia. I hope that answers.
Great. I'm going to bring this to a close because I think we have run out of time. I think you've definitely expanded our knowledge this afternoon, so thank you. I love the way you talked about the power of education, because I think that's something we all believe in. The power of storytelling, and I think that's something that those of us who are academics definitely need to get better at. So thank you. And I love your optimism, particularly for solutions coming out of Southeast Asia. And I think you're right. And I loved your optimism for the world that we will eventually manage to solve this challenge in a way that is equitable and allows more people to live a flourishing and fulfilling life. So thank you very much, Geeta. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
For those of you who really enjoyed the University of Nottingham angle, we've got another session tomorrow on, what's our session tomorrow on? 11:15. Yes, so it's 11:30 tomorrow. We've got another session on regional solutions and global lessons, energy decarbonisation and sustainable industry. So hope to see some of you there. Thank you very much for attending. Thank you.